The smell of wood smoke clung to the rafters, drifting above a long table laid with stew, cornbread, and rough-cut venison. The stakes were simple, but absolute. Only one side of this table would live to see dawn. In the remote folds of the Ozark Mountains, sometime in the late 1840s, the Carter homestead looked like any other frontier dwelling. Logs stacked tight against winter's breath, iron pots blackened from years of use, and a single oil lamp casting its wavering glow over weathered faces. Yet beneath the clatter of spoons and the creak of timber, there was an unseen current, because this table was not filled only with kin. It was filled with captors and captives, a family who had built its life on ownership and those who plotted to take it back. The Carter patriarch, Elias, prided himself on being a man of order. By his side sat Martha, her bonnet tied neat, eyes sharp as needles. Their 4 grown children leaned into the lamplight, hungry from a day spent tallying yields and tightening chains. Across from them, in the shadows by the wall, the enslaved workers stood silent, waiting for scraps. Among them was Josiah, who had once been a blacksmith before being sold down into these hills. His calloused hands now stirred ashes in the hearth, but his eyes never left the stew pot. Outside, coyotes yipped across the ridgeline. The stew simmered with a hiss, and somewhere deep in the walls, time ticked louder than the clock itself. The Ozarks had always been a place of secrets. Limestone caves that swallowed sound, hollows where travelers vanished, neighbors who minded their own. It was here that whispers began of a family that did more than punish, a family that consumed. Were the rumors true, or just frontier fear spun into campfire tales? That question, left hanging in the smoke, is what has brought this story down to us. Imagine sitting at that table, a bowl of stew pressed into your hands, steam fogging your vision. Do you eat, knowing what others have whispered about this family? Or do you set the spoon down, waiting to see who takes the first bite? The hour was 7:30, according to the iron clock above the mantel. By 8, the meal would be over. By 9, nothing in the Carter house would ever be the same again. Darkness thickened in the valley. The lamp guttered low, and as Elias lifted his spoon for the first mouthful, Josiah's hand lingered on the ladle just a moment too long. Whose table was it, now the master's, or the enslaved man's who held the seasoning of life and death? That question will take us deeper into the legend of the Cannibal family of the Ozark Mountain. Before we go further, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below, and if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what follows is not just a frontier rumor, but a dark tale preserved in scraps of record and memory. The coyotes fell silent. A floorboard creaked overhead, and Elias Carter, spoon halfway to his mouth, turned toward the sound with a frown that would never leave his face. The night was only beginning. The wind outside rattled the shutters, carrying with it the resinous smell of pine and the faint cry of an owl. Inside, the stew thickened, clinging to each bowl with a weight that felt heavier than hunger. The stakes had sharpened. Who would walk away from this table alive? In the dim back room of the Carter house, a ledger lay open on the desk. Its pages bore columns of figures written in a firm, angular hand. Bushels harvested, debts owed, and names listed not as men and women, but as assets. Josiah's name appeared halfway down, valued at $600. Beneath it, 3 other names carried smaller sums. Each stroke of ink was another chain, binding flesh to arithmetic. Yet tucked into the margins, faint and almost erased, were marks that no white eye had noticed. Small crosses, penciled by Josiah when no one watched. Each cross represented a night spent planning. The Carters prided themselves on efficiency. Every evening meal began at 7, sharp every lamp extinguished by 9. Order disguised cruelty, but cruelty left cracks. Elias's youngest son, Thomas, had brought back tins of strange powder from Street Louis, calling it preservative salt. He thought it would stretch venison through the winter. Josiah had watched carefully, noting the difference in smell when it burned, sharp and metallic. Salt could preserve, but in certain hands, it could also end. "Pass the bread," Martha Carter said sharply, and her voice sliced through the room. The children obeyed, laughter forced, but their eyes flicked nervously toward the door. They had heard whispers too, the kind that seep through walls when servants speak softly at night. Yet they dismissed them, as planters always did, certain that fear belonged only on one side of the whip. At the hearth, Josiah's mind ran quicker than his hands. He remembered the words of his grandmother, spoken years before he was sold south. Chains rust, but patience sharpens. Tonight, patience was honed to a blade. The lamp crackled, the stew steamed. Elias lifted his glass of whiskey, the amber liquid trembling as his hand betrayed the faintest shake. "To the Carters," he said, his voice grand but weary. "To our land, our blood, our order." Glasses clinked, yet the toast rang hollow. Imagine standing in that doorway, hearing his words. Would you step forward, risk everything to shatter that order? Or would you wait, silent, knowing that one wrong glance could undo years of careful plotting? The clock ticked toward 8:15. Upstairs, the boards creaked again. Perhaps it was only the wind, or perhaps someone moving where they should not be. Elias frowned once more, but this time his wife placed a hand on his sleeve. "Sit," she whispered. "You imagine shadows, but shadows in houses built on cruelty are rarely imagined." 3 small crosses in a ledger. 3 powders hidden behind flour sacks. 3 moments when patience would become action. The stew cooled in their bowls, and in the stillness between each tick of the clock, the Carter family failed to notice that their supper had already become a sentence. The next hour would reveal who had written it. Rain began tapping the roof in thin, deliberate strokes, the scent of wet clay creeping through the chinks in the logs. In the dining room, spoons scraped bowls, each sound sharp as a blade. The stakes were rising. Silence itself was starting to carry weight. That same evening, 3 riders had set out from the valley. Neighbors, they claimed, summoned for a late errand by Elias Carter himself. But by dawn their horses would return alone, reins dragging in the mud, eyes rolling white. No word ever came from the men, and their family spoke of them only in whispers thereafter. The Ozark Mountains were thick with caves, sinkholes, and streams that could swallow a man whole. Yet some swore they never left the Carter place at all. Inside the house, the laughter had thinned. Martha fussed with the lamp wick, her sharp nose twitching as though the stew carried a strange undertone. But she said nothing. Perhaps she thought it impolite to doubt the food that had filled their table for years. Or perhaps she did not wish to name aloud what others already suspected, that something about tonight was off. Near the hearth, Josiah stirred the ashes. His face showed nothing, but his ears caught every whisper, every uncertain cough. He knew the riders had not gone far. He knew the mountain trails by heart, the caves where sound went to die. What he did not know was whether fear alone would paralyze the rest of the household, or whether they would act when the moment came. Elias spoke again, his voice too loud for the quiet room. "We are Carters," he declared, gripping the table edge. "We have enemies, but we stand." The words fell like stones into a well, vanishing into depth. The children nodded dutifully, though their eyes darted toward the window, where rain traced lines down the glass. Imagine being one of those riders' wives, waking to an empty stall, listening for hooves that never returned. Would you demand answers? March to the Carter house with questions? Or would you stay silent, knowing that in these mountains, some questions end lives? By 8:30, the stew sat untouched before several of the Carters. The air grew heavy. the smell of wet pine now mixed with something metallic. Martha pressed a handkerchief to her lips. Thomas muttered about feeling unwell. Upstairs, the boards creaked again. The Carters glanced at one another, waiting for someone to act. None did. 3 riders gone. 3 shadows upstairs. 3 Carters shifting uneasily in their chairs. The rain quickened against the roof, and the night began to lean toward revelation. A gust of wind slipped through the cracks, carrying with it the earthy smell of wet moss, the drip of rainwater, and the brittle groan of timbers. The Carter dining room had become a stage where silence spoke louder than words. The stakes now pressed heavy. Who upstairs was moving, and why? At 8:45, a whisper drifted from the rafters above the parlor. It was not the shuffle of mice, nor the creak of beams settling. It was unmistakably human. Martha froze, her spoon hovering midair. Thomas, pale and sweating, pushed back his chair. Elias slammed a fist on the table. "Who's there?" he barked. The house swallowed the command whole. No answer came, yet the whispers grew bolder. Soft, deliberate syllables. Josiah recognized them, though he kept his eyes lowered. They were in Gullah, the tongue of the coastal people carried inland through generations. To the Carters, it was nonsense. To Josiah, it was instruction. Wait, hold. The hour is near. The lamp flame wavered. The smell of stew turned acrid in Thomas's nostrils, and he gagged, shoving the bowl away. His mother scolded him, but her own hand trembled as she lifted her glass. Elias, desperate to assert control, drained his whiskey and reached for another pour. The liquid burned, but it did not soothe. Down the road, the Turner family claimed later they heard a chorus that night, faint but carried on the wind, singing, a low, rhythmic chant rising from the Carter house. They shut their shutters, barred the door, and told themselves it was thunder. What would you have done? Gone to investigate, or turned away, grateful it was not your burden? By 9, the whispers overhead had become footsteps. Slow, deliberate, each tread a nail in the coffin of Carter authority. Elias drew the pistol he kept tucked in the sideboard. His hand shook as he cocked the hammer, the metallic click echoing too loud in the cramped room. "Show yourself," he demanded again, but the footsteps did not quicken, nor did they stop. They moved toward the stairwell, unhurried, as though the person above had no fear of being discovered. Josiah's heart thudded, yet outwardly he moved only to add another log to the fire, sparks leaping like omens. The Carters had ruled this hollow with lash and ledger, but now the walls themselves seemed to close in. Whispers became song. Song became tread, and tread became the promise of descent. The hour was 9:15. Shadows pooled at the top of the stairs. The family leaned forward, every breath caught in their throats. And then, slowly, a figure began to appear. The staircase groaned beneath each step, the sound carrying like a drumbeat through the timbered house. The smell of damp wool clung to the figure's clothes, mingling with the faint tang of iron, and the lamplight stretched its shadow long against the wall. The stakes now were bare. If this figure was ally, the Carters might survive the night. If enemy, their fate was sealed. At the landing appeared Ruth, a woman the Carters considered invisible, though she had worked their household for over a decade. Her head was wrapped in a faded kerchief, her eyes catching the lamplight with unnerving calm. Behind her, another shadow lingered, broader, silent, waiting. Elias's pistol lifted, trembling in his grip. "Why are you upstairs?" he demanded. Ruth's voice was even, almost gentle. "Checking leaks, master." Ruth gives way with the rain. Her tone masked the truth, yet every syllable carried weight. Josiah, by the hearth, knew what her presence meant. The hour was chosen. Martha Carter whispered a prayer, fingers clutching her apron. Thomas swore under his breath. The younger daughters exchanged fearful glances. They all knew something unspoken hung in the air. Yet none of them rose from the table. None dared approach Ruth, as though proximity itself might reveal what she carried. From outside, thunder rolled across the hollow. Neighbors later swore they heard it too, though some insisted it was not thunder at all, but pounding, like fists against wood. They shut their windows tighter, unwilling to question. And you, if you had been there, hearing strange sounds from a house already whispered about, would you have stepped into the rain to investigate, or chosen safety in silence? Elias steadied his aim. The barrel pointed at Ruth's chest. His voice cracked, but his words stayed cold. If there's something you hide, woman, I'll see it now. Ruth took another step forward, unflinching. Then look, she said. Her hand slid from behind her back, revealing not a weapon, but a small folded paper. She laid it on the table, her eyes never leaving Elias's. Ledger, master, names you forgot, accounts you left unpaid. Elias frowned, lowering the pistol just enough to reach for the paper. The moment his fingers touched it, his youngest daughter gasped, not at the ledger, but at the stew pot. Steam no longer rose. The liquid had gone cold, congealed far too fast, as though the fire beneath it had died long ago. The clock marked 9:30. Every tick seemed to press harder into the silence. Elias opened the paper with clumsy fingers. What he saw there drained the color from his face. Crosses, dozens of them. Not one or two, but a whole page marked with careful, deliberate hands. Ruth's calm did not break. Josiah's stare from the hearth did not waver, and Elias Carter understood too late that the meal before him had been planned not hours ago, but for years. The figure at the bottom of the stairs had descended, but it was the Carters' power that was falling. The storm outside had swelled, drumming the roof with relentless rhythm, while the scent of wet earth pressed through every seam in the Carter house. The stew sat heavy in bowls, untouched by some, half-finished by others. Stakes now towered over the room, whether the family's suspicions hardened into action or dissolved into helpless silence. At 9:45, Thomas pushed back from the table, his face clammy. "Something ain't right," he muttered, pressing a hand to his stomach. His sister, Martha Ann, gave a nervous laugh, insisting it was just the venison too rich for his blood. Yet her own spoon slipped from trembling fingers, clattering against the floor. Elias's eyes narrowed. He glanced at Ruth, still standing calm and straight, near the table's end, then at Josiah by the fire, poker in hand. The ledger page lay open where Elias had dropped it, its forest of penciled crosses visible to all. For the first time, the Carters considered that their order, their law of ownership and obedience, might have been nothing but a house balanced on rotting beams. From beyond the walls came faint music, low voices carried on the storm. It was no fiddle, no frontier hymn, but a chant that throbbed with patience and anger. The Carters stiffened. Elias barked, "Neighbors," as if to convince himself, but even he did not rise. Neighbors would not sing through thunder. Josiah shifted the poker in the coals, sparks crackling upward like tiny fireflies. His voice was quiet but deliberate. When a chain breaks, you don't always hear the snap. Sometimes you feel it after. His words hung heavy, neither confession nor threat, but truth spoken into a room unused to hearing it. Martha Carter's lips tightened. She reached for the silver bell beside her plate, the same bell she rang for servants each day. Its chime was sharp, slicing through the house, but no one moved. In the kitchen, where normally footsteps would hurry at her call, silence answered. Imagine being in that kitchen, hearing the bell shrill above the storm. Would you run to aid the family who had ordered your life? Or would you continue folding rags, washing dishes, waiting for the bell's echo to fade into nothing? The storm hammered harder, the chant outside growing bolder. The Carters' eldest son rose unsteadily, declaring he would fetch his rifle, but his knees buckled before he reached the door. His hand clawed at the wall, then slipped, leaving him sprawled across the rug. The clock struck 10. Each note carried a weight, like a funeral toll. Around the table, breath grew ragged, voices fractured into coughs. Elias tried to raise his pistol again, but his grip failed, the iron clattering across the floorboards. Martha Ann clutched her mother's arm, eyes wide with a dawning terror that even prayer could not soften. The stew bowls sat like gravestones. The ledger with its marks whispered its verdict, and outside, the chant had turned to a steady pounding feet striking earth in rhythm, as though the mountain itself had joined in the judgment. The Carters looked to the windows, to the doors, to one another, but no help was coming. The rain slowed to a steady patter, each drop sharp against the roof, while the smell of wet ash drifted from the hearth where Josiah worked the poker. The Carter dining room had changed, no longer a place of supper, but a chamber of reckoning. The stakes were absolute. Survival was measured not in wealth or land, but in each labored breath. At 10:15, Martha Carter rang the silver bell again. Its note rang pure, bright, urgent, but in the quarters outside, where 47 enslaved souls lived, the sound was met with silence. Children tucked tighter into their mothers' arms. Men stared at the floor. Women kept folding clothes, plaiting hair, whispering hymns. They all heard the bell. They all chose stillness. What would you have done if that bell summoned you? Run to help those who ruled your life, or hold back, knowing that silence was the first taste of freedom? Inside the house, Elias staggered from his chair, his voice cracking. Fetch Dr. Hammond. But his order faltered into a cough that racked his chest. His pistol lay forgotten near the rug, inches from where his eldest son groaned, face pale and slick with sweat. Ruth stood near the base of the stairs, hands folded in her apron, calm as stone. The daughters looked at her with dawning realization. This woman they had overlooked, ordered, dismissed. She was not a servant tonight. She was a witness, and perhaps more. At 10:30, Thomas collapsed against the table, knocking over a candle. Wax spilled, flame guttering before Josiah's steady hand pinched it out. In the darkness between relighting, the room felt like a coffin, sealed tight against the storm outside. When the lamp's glow returned, faces were gray, lips trembling, eyes darting like cornered animals. Neighbors later claimed they saw light flicker through the Carter windows that night, then vanish. Some thought the family had gone to bed early. Some suspected more. Yet not one approached, though the hollow was alive with sound. Fear makes bystanders complicit, and fear was thick across the Ozarks that night. By 10:45, the Carter daughters wept openly, calling for mercy, calling for God, calling for anyone but themselves. But the house held only silence in return. Elias's voice broke into a roar, then into a rasp. He fell to his knees, hands spread on the floor, as though begging the very timbers to hold him. The stew congealed in bowls untouched. The ledger, with its rows of crosses, remained open, a page that no one dared close. Josiah stirred the coals one final time and let the poker rest. The Carter bell lay silent. No servant came. No neighbor arrived. Only the rain, the faint chant outside, and the creak of rafters overhead bore witness. The hour struck 11. The house that had once ruled this valley now crouched in its own silence, waiting for the final hand to fall. And as shadows stretched across the floor, Ruth whispered words the Carters could not understand, but Josiah did. The reckoning is not finished. The wind shifted, carrying the raw scent of pine needles and damp stone through the chinks in the Carter house. A floorboard moaned under Elias's boots as he struggled to rise, his body betraying him with every breath. The stakes had narrowed to a single truth: whether any Carter bloodline would see another sunrise. At 11:15, the storm outside eased, leaving only the sound of dripping eaves and the steady pulse of chanting from the quarters. Each syllable rose like smoke, curling into the night air. The daughters clung to one another, their sobs punctuating the silence between chants. Martha Carter gripped the silver bell again, though her arm shook too violently to lift it from the table. She whispered, "Help us. Someone help." But no help came. Josiah remained by the hearth, watching, his face carved from shadow. Ruth moved only once to open the shutters. Cold night air swept in, carrying with it the sound of dozens of voices. The Carters stared in disbelief as the chorus grew louder. Their world, once bounded by chains and ledgers, was dissolving under song. Elias tried to speak, but his words slurred into nonsense. His son James scrawled on a scrap of paper with a shaking hand. Ruth did this. Josiah did this. The letters sprawled crooked, ink smeared. He shoved it toward the middle of the table, as though confession could save him. Ruth looked at the note and then back at James, her expression unreadable. At 11:30, Thomas collapsed entirely, his head striking the table with a hollow thud. Martha Ann screamed, then fell silent, clutching her stomach as though it were filled with stones. Elias staggered toward the doorway, pistol forgotten, and collapsed against the frame. His last sight was of Ruth standing calm and still, while Josiah's eyes burned steady through the firelight. Imagine yourself in that moment, standing in the shadows. Would you have stepped forward, tried to save the family who had never saved you? Or would you have stood back, letting silence and time finish what years of cruelty had begun? By 11:45, the Carter house was a gallery of collapse. Chairs overturned, dishes scattered, bodies groaning or stilled. The chant outside grew louder, pulsing with a rhythm that felt older than the mountains themselves. Ruth closed the shutters once more, sealing the house in darkness. The clock ticked on, and then, at midnight, the sound stopped. No chant, no cry, only the faint drip of rain into the yard. The Carters lay where they had fallen. The enslaved stood where they had chosen. The house exhaled into silence. Some say that from that night on, the Carter place was never lived in again. Neighbors whispered that the walls held an odor no fire could cleanse, a smell of iron and ash that clung to every rafter. Hunters swore that when they passed near the hollow, they heard a bell ring faintly, though the silver bell itself was long gone. Legend claims the Carter family didn't just die, they were consumed. Not by fire, nor by poison alone, but by vengeance that took flesh as its price. Some even whispered that Ruth and Josiah served a final supper none would dare describe. The Carter homestead still stood a decade later, slumped and rotting into the hillside. Children dared one another to step inside, swearing they saw shadows at the table, waiting. And in the present day, locals say that if you walk those woods at night, you'll hear the faint chime of a bell, followed by singing in a tongue no one has spoken for a century. The dawn that followed broke pale and brittle, light glinting off wet leaves and painting the valley in muted gold. The Carter house stood still, smoke gone from its chimney, windows dark, the air heavy with the odor of cold stew and overturned candles. The stakes had reached their final weight. History would decide whether this was justice, vengeance, or a horror better left unnamed. At 6 o'clock that morning, a neighboring farmer finally approached. His wagon creaked over the mud, horses uneasy as they neared the hollow. He later claimed he smelled iron before he saw anything, an acrid tang that made him pull a handkerchief over his mouth. When he reached the porch, he found the door ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. Inside lay silence, the kind that hums in your ears. The Carter table was still set. Bowls sat where they had been dropped. The ledger with its crosses lay open, ink blurred by spilled whiskey. Around it lay the family, each frozen where night had taken them. The farmer did not enter farther. He turned his horses and left at once, spreading word without details. Few dared to confirm. For weeks, no authority came to claim the bodies. No minister stood to give rights. The Ozark trails whispered that justice had been done by unseen hands, and neighbors chose to leave it there. The Carters had vanished, and the hollow belonged to silence. Yet the enslaved community was not silent. That very night, when the valley knew no eyes were watching, families gathered by the river. They sang in low voices, voices carrying grief and defiance in equal measure. Children clutched hands, elders lifted their heads to the stars. Josiah spoke little, but Ruth was said to have stood at the riverbank, kerchief loose in her hands, face turned east. Imagine that moment. To breathe a dawn, not filled with orders or fear, but with the possibility, brief, fragile, of something different. Would you have stayed in the valley, risking retribution, or fled into the mountains, trusting only the trees? Within months, the Carter property fell to ruin. The land, once surveyed and measured in ledgers, grew wild. Blackberry thickets swallowed the paths. Vines crept over the porch, and the house sagged into itself, as if ashamed of its history. Travelers avoided the road, saying the woods pressed too close, the air too heavy. By 1853, stories had hardened into legend. Some told of a family poisoned at their own table. Others swore darker, that when hunger and rage met in the hollow, the Carters were not merely killed, but consumed. Every retelling shifted, but one detail remained constant: the bell, always the bell. Its sound in the night, unanswered. A schoolteacher visiting the Ozarks decades later wrote in his diary, "The locals will not speak of the Carter Hollow after dark. Children dare each other to run past it. Some return pale, claiming they heard singing in a tongue no one taught them." And so the tale endures, not in courthouse records, not in official histories, but in the air of the Ozarks themselves. A story told in whispers, a warning wrapped in legend. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.